I think this is an opportunity to take coverage that was really someone's experiment with their interpretation of unschooling and turn that into something that's actually going to provide information and examples and maybe even support for people wanting to explore unschooling today. I am Akilah S. Richards. I'm an unschooling organizer and podcaster, and I was referenced in this piece by Good Morning America recently. And there was quite a bit in there that they got wrong. I want to give you some examples. I have my notes over here because I'm going to highlight the ways that schoolishness, this pervasive thing, influences the way that we explore everything, even things like unschooling. The first thing it says, the basic premise of unschooling is that it's a form of homeschooling that is child-led. The child's natural interests inform the parents, their education partner, what to teach. No. Children's interests inform parents on children's interests, which help them get to know that child in particular. Parents are not inherent teachers. Learning is happening all the time in a bunch of different ways. And while that's happening, there's a relationship simultaneously forming between a parent and a child, one that can either be schoolish and therefore rooted in grade levels and ideas about what to learn by third grade, or it can be an unschooling approach in that it trusts that learning isn't something to simulate or pass down without it being asked, but instead a natural occurrence, right? A natural occurrence when interest, trust, and some levels of access are present in a child's environment. So it's never about figuring out what to teach a child. It's about learning to see and value a child's natural relationship to life and to people and to the things in their environment. So you can offer ideas to children in unschooling, and you can respect their choice to either accept or reject something that you offer. Another thing, Richards has been unschooling both her daughters for several years, despite them being academically successful in traditional school. So first of all, I don't unschool my children. Unschooling is not something that you do to children or even for them. It's something that you do with them. It's something you're doing all together. You're all unschooling from the idea of what it means to learn and to teach. So the relationship with teacher and with learner, they shift in unschooling. So that's the first thing. We don't unschool our children, Chris and I. We are all unschoolers. And the wording of it, the framing of it, despite them being, what's the term? Academically successful. I think the positioning of that gives the impression that unschooling is something that you choose if your child just isn't doing well in school. So it's something that you're kind of forced to look at, as opposed to something that you can choose from an empowered space. There's some people who, like us, we chose it not because the girls weren't doing well in school, but because the people, the actual girls, not the students, not the first grader and fourth grader as they were at the time, but the actual people, Marley and Sage, were compromised. And we recognize that and reference that all the time when we talk about why we chose to unschool. And so I think it's important to recognize that that could potentially sound like if your children are doing well in school, then you don't need to look at unschooling, which isn't true. Third thing I noticed, I decided to dip my toe into unschooling. Disclosure, I'm not an educator and I'm certainly not a homeschooling expert. No one's a homeschooling expert. Even if you have a lot of experience with homeschooling, when it comes to unschooling, which is the context of this article, there is no expert. There's time and experience with that kid and with that adult, like with that family. The only expertise can be developed over time with that particular family. no one can be an expert on your child, not even you, and no one can be an expert on your family. Only you can develop those expertise. So really important to point that out if you're thinking about unschooling, and people labeling people like me as experts, when I'm only an expert in unschooling as my family practices it. And I'm also a space, because I do a podcast, where you can hear how other people engage it. Big difference between saying that someone is an expert, or that you need to be an expert to be at home with your child, or to embrace self-directed education, because you couldn't be an expert in advance, you know? Another thing I noticed, so it says, we chose Ladybugs because he loves a show called Ben and Holly's Little Kingdom, and seems as good a place to start as any. So right away, big schoolishness flag. A good place to start would be to ask your child, what do you want to focus on today? I want to be with you while you're learning. Because if you're starting out in unschooling, you might phrase something that way because you still are looking at learning as a specific set of tasks that you do and can identify as educational, which is okay if you're starting out. So a good place to start would be to ask a child what thing they'd want to focus on, or to pay attention to what thing they are focusing on, since you didn't give them something to focus on, and then to use that thing as your permission, as your catalyst for, framing a learning experience. Again, this is if you're testing out unschooling, because in unschooling, you wouldn't frame a learning experience. You'd observe all the many ways that learning happens. So yeah, the main point of that one is to say the good place to start would just be to ask, as opposed to decide and implement without the input of the child. Another one, where under the subtitle, Our Unschooling Curriculum, it says, I started by thinking about the basic things my kindergartner needs to work on: counting, adding, fine motor skills, and increasing time at non-preferred activities are at the top of the list. That is the opposite of unschooling. Who made the list? The list speaks to a concept, a label, a timeline that is artificial. Human beings at all ages and stages, even childhood, maybe particularly childhood, learn at different paces, like how plants grow at different paces and stages. People, we, you and I, are as such. So to decide that because in school, this is what someone at this age is assumed to know or should know, to bring that at home is a mistake, because it gets in the way of you being able to see what a child actually is doing, what they are interested in, what they might even already be good at any age, and being able to help them amplify that, go deeper into that, connect with things that may be related to the thing they're into that they might not even know, or for you to watch them go super, super niche detail into something and not bring in a bunch of other aspects of it into the mix because that doesn't feel necessary, To decide in advance that they needed to work on counting, adding, fine motor skills, and taking more time to do things that they don't want to do is a very schoolish approach to something called unschooling. It's a very schoolish approach to learning. So instead, you would observe, you would offer questions about what you're observing, to the child. Oh, how come you chose this game and not that game? Oh, how come you like this book and not that book? You can ask and gauge whether or not that's intrusive. Some children love to be asked questions. They love that feeling of someone being really engaged in something they chose for themselves, and they'll engage those questions and you'll learn a lot that way. Other children that would be, I don't know if you can hear that truck. For other children, that might feel intrusive to them, and so you would observe without asking. You would find other ways to engage in conversation with them about what they're interested in and why, and offer ways in support of that. Ask them how you can support that. Over the course of 2 days, we practiced all the skills he needs to work on and learned a lot about ladybugs along the way. So the decision that those particular skills were skills that he needed to work on is rooted in schoolishness. It's rooted in the idea that children generally should know these things by this time. You could see that as keeping up so that when we go back to the norm, they're not behind their classmates. Or you can see this as an opportunity to learn who and how your kid is and where they are in their learning process, and supporting that, not necessarily by trying to fix what they're not doing, but by amplifying and supporting what they are doing, and determining for yourself whether these things that they're not doing are actually a problem. Is it actually a problem that they don't count up to 10 at a certain age? Are there other things that you're not seeing about what they do know that are just as important as whether they can count or not right now? These are the things you're getting the opportunity to pay attention to that you might not have had a chance to, really pay attention to and assess, to slow down and assess for yourself, really think about, as opposed to accept it as a problem. And the last thing I'll point out is under the subheading, the verdict. It says, we worked on the skills he needs to address, and his siblings worked right alongside him. It was such a success that my third grader got to pick her own unschooling topic for next week. So again, there's the idea of working on the skills that needed to be worked on. Once you determine which skills need to be worked on, then you miss an opportunity to see what is happening and to support and amplify that. Someone getting to pick out their curriculum is not unschooling. It's school at home with some choice, which if you are going to do school at home, integrating choice as much as you can is good. But if you are referencing unschooling, and if that is what you want to dip your toe into, then the curriculum would not be determined in advance without not just the input of the child, but by the child. That's all I got. Hopefully that makes this article a little bit more informative. And let me know your thoughts in the comments. Or if you're listening to this on the podcast, message me on the show notes page for this episode. Thanks for watching and listening.